Welcome. Tonight, we are going to take a journey back in time to a place of secrets, silence, and vast open horizons. Before we begin, find a comfortable position. Lie back, let your shoulders drop, and unclench your jaw. Close your eyes. Take a deep, slow breath in, filling your lungs with cool, fresh air, and exhale slowly, letting go of the tension of the day. Again, breathe in deeply and breathe out. Imagine you are standing on the edge of a high plateau in New Mexico. The year is 1943, but the chaos of the world feels very far away. Here, there is only the scent of sagebrush, the warmth of the sun fading into twilight, and the sound of the wind moving through the ponderosa pines. You are about to enter the secret city, a place that for a few years technically did not exist. A place where the smartest minds in the world gathered in the middle of a desert to solve the biggest puzzle in history. But tonight, we are not here for the noise or the fury. We are here for the quiet. We are here to walk the dusty streets, to sit in the silent laboratories, and to watch the stars turn slowly over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Let the history surround you like a heavy, comforting blanket. Let the rhythm of the story calm your mind. You are safe, you are relaxed, and you are ready to listen. Let us begin. The wind is the oldest resident here. Long before the physicists arrived with their chalkboards and their heavy secrets, the wind was already carving the canyons of the Payurito Plateau. It moves through the ponderosa pines with a sound like the ocean, a rhythmic rushing noise that rises and falls, sweeping across the high desert of New Mexico. In 1943, this wind blew through a world that was about to vanish, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dry earth, swirling around the wooden structures of a boys' school that was rapidly being transformed into the most important and most hidden place on earth. To understand the secret, you must first understand the silence. If you were to stand on the edge of the mesa in the early spring of that year, looking out toward the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in the east, the silence would feel physical, a heavy blanket of calm. The air here is thin and crisp, sitting at 7,000 feet above sea level. It is a place where the sky feels closer, a vast dome of piercing blue during the day, and an infinite ocean of stars at night. It was here, in this isolation, that a train slowed to a halt at the tiny, dusty station of Lamy, many miles away from the final destination. The train ride was the first step into the unknown. For the passengers disembarking, mostly young men in ill-fitting suits and women holding tightly to their handbags, the journey had been a riddle. They had been told to go to a cryptic address in Santa Fe, 109 East Palace Avenue. They did not know they were heading to a laboratory built on top of a volcano's ancient footprint. They only knew that their country needed them and that they would be disappearing from the known world. Imagine the wooden platform at Lamy under the midday sun. The heat waves shimmer off the tracks. The conductor's watch ticks slowly. There is the smell of creosote and coal smoke. These travelers, some of the most brilliant minds in Europe and America, looked out at the beige and red landscape, wondering where the laboratory could possibly be. There were no skyscrapers here, No industrial smokestacks, only the rolling scrubland and the distant purple-hued mountains. They were guided into cars and buses, engines humming a monotonous drone as they began the long, winding ascent up the hill. The road to the site was treacherous and unpaved, a dirt track that hugged the sheer cliffs of the canyon. As the vehicles climbed, the air grew cooler, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. The engines strained against the incline. This slow, hypnotic climb was a transition. They were leaving behind the chaotic, war-torn world of 1943 and entering a suspended reality, a place that technically did not exist, a place where names were replaced with numbers and where the primary sound was not the roar of battle, but the scratching of chalk on a blackboard and the low hum of a cyclotron. Upon reaching the top of the mesa, the first thing they saw was not a futuristic city of chrome and glass, but mud, acres and acres of mud. It was a frontier town, hasty and raw. Construction crews were working around the clock, their hammers creating a dull, rhythmic thudding that echoed off the canyon walls. The secret city, known only as Site Y, was being built in real time. There were rows of green army barracks, simple wooden structures that smelled of fresh lumber and tar paper. There were unpaved streets that turned into sticky clay when it rained and choked the air with fine brown dust when it was dry. But beneath the rough exterior, there was a quiet, intense order. The security perimeter was the first layer of the hush that surrounded the city. Tall chain-link fences topped with barbed wire encircled the entire mesa. At the main gate, military police stood like statues, checking badges with slow, deliberate movements. The pass had to be right. The face had to match. There was no hurrying here. Security was a ritual, a repetitive dance of verification that happened every time someone entered or left. Life inside the fence moved at a different pace. It was a strange mixture of a college campus and a prison camp, wrapped in the serene beauty of the wilderness. In the evenings, after the construction noise died down, the silence of the desert reclaimed the mesa. The scientists and their families, living in the rapidly assembled sunt apartments or the drafty barracks, would listen to the coyotes howling in the distance. The sound was lonely and wild, a reminder of how far away they were from civilization. For the newcomers, the first night was always the most profound. Lying in narrow army cots, staring up at the rough wooden beams of the ceiling, they could hear the wind buffeting the thin walls. The isolation was absolute. They had no phone numbers to give their families, no address other than P.O. Box 1663, Santa Fe, New Mexico. That single post office box would become the most famous address in the history of science, the funnel through which all letters, all birth certificates, all connection to the outside world had to pass. It was a bottleneck of information, monitored and censored, adding another layer to the quiet bubble they lived in. Morning on the mesa began with the light. The sun rose over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, painting the sky in shades of violet, orange, and gold. The light in New Mexico is famous for its clarity. It reveals every crevice in the rock, every needle on the pine trees. In this sharp morning light, the men and women of the Manhattan Project began their routine. It was a routine of walking. Few people had cars. They walked from the housing quarters along the dirt paths to the tech area, the heart of the project. The sound of hundreds of feet crunching on the gravel was the morning alarm. The tech area was guarded by another layer of security. Inside, the atmosphere shifted from domestic to clinical. Here, the buildings were nondescript, painted a dull green to blend in with the forest from the air. But inside these sheds, the future was being written. The work was slow, methodical, and incredibly precise. It wasn't about loud explosions, not yet. It was about calculations. It was about the slow accumulation of data. In the theoretical physics division, the room was often silent for hours, save for the soft tapping of chalk. A young physicist might stand at a board, covering it with Greek letters and integrals, lost in a trance of concentration. The dust from the chalk would drift through shafts of sunlight, settling on the wooden floor. In the corner, a radiator might hiss and clank, a cozy domestic sound in a room where the fundamental forces of the universe were being taken apart. Robert Oppenheimer, the man orchestrating this vast, silent symphony, was a spectral presence. He moved through the muddy streets in his pork-pie hat and trench coat, a trail of pipe smoke following him like a ghost. He spoke softly. He was known for his intense, blue-eyed gaze that seemed to look right through people. He didn't shout orders, he asked questions. His voice was part of the mesmerizing texture of the place, calm, persuasive, and always thinking. He was the conductor of the hill, ensuring that the thousands of disparate minds, the chemists, the metallurgists, the mathematicians, all were flowing in the same direction, like the water in the canyon streams below. The secrecy required a suppression of the ego, a quieting of the self. Nobel Prize winners worked alongside graduate students. Names were often changed for safety. The famous Enrico Fermi became Henry Farmer. The great Niels Bohr became Nicholas Baker. They were shadows of themselves, drifting through the high desert, stripped of their fame and left only with their intellects. This anonymity added to the dreamlike quality of life there. You might be buying cigarettes at the commissary next to a man who had revolutionized quantum mechanics, and you would simply nod and comment on the dust. The dust was everywhere. It was the constant companion of the secret city. It found its way into the bedsheets, into the coffee, into the delicate gears of the calculation machines. The maids who cleaned the barracks waged a silent, eternal war against it. They swept the floors in long, rhythmic strokes, the sound of the bristles on wood becoming part of the background noise of the afternoon. Swish, 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 a hypnotic cadence that marked the passing of time in a place where time seemed to be holding its breath. Even the water was precious and scarce. The pipes that brought water up the mesa were old and prone to freezing in the sharp winter nights. Water conservation was a daily mantra. Residents were told to bathe briefly, to save every drop. The sound of a dripping tap was not just an annoyance, it was a violation of the community's survival. The scarcity created a sense of shared austerity, a quiet discipline that bound everyone together. As the months turned into years, the rhythm of the seasons dictated the mood of the project. Winter on the hill was severe and beautiful. Snow fell in heavy, silent sheets, blanketing the ugly mud and the sharp angles of the fences. The world became white and soft. Sound was dampened even further. The tire chains of the army jeeps clinking on the ice, the crunch of boots on packed snow, the steam rising from the vents of the laboratories were the sensory details of the long winters. Inside the labs, the lights burned warm and yellow against the blue twilight outside. The work continued, relentless and steady, a slow-motion race against a terrifying enemy across the ocean. But it wasn't all grim determination. There was a surreal normalcy to the social life that developed in this vacuum. On Saturday nights, the scientists would gather in the log lodge that had once belonged to the boys' school. They would push aside the tables and dance. A phonograph would play scratchy jazz records or classical waltzes. The music would drift out of the open windows and dissolve into the vast, empty darkness of the canyon. To an observer standing on a distant peak, the lights of Los Alamos would have looked like a lonely ship at sea, a cluster of warmth in a cold, indifferent ocean of darkness.
The music from the Saturday night dance would fade, and the silence of Sunday morning would settle over the mesa like a fine dust. But the work never truly stopped. The war did not observe the Sabbath, and neither did the machine that was Site Y. The transition from the social warmth of the lodge back to the cold, sterile logic of the laboratories was seamless. As the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist that clung to the canyon walls, the rhythm of the week began again, a rhythm defined not by hours, but by the slow, grinding progress of discovery. In the theoretical division, known simply as T division, the soundscape was distinct. It was the sound of pure mathematics being ground out by human hands. Before the age of digital silence, calculation was a noisy mechanical process. The rooms here were filled with rows of women, the human computers, sitting at heavy wooden desks. In front of them sat black metal machines, Marchant and Friden mechanical calculators. The air in these rooms was thick with the smell of machine oil and the sharp tang of pencil shavings. If you were to close your eyes and listen, it would sound like a room full of clockwork crickets. Clack, 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 ding, clack, 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 ding. Hundreds of keys being pressed, hundreds of gears turning, levers being pulled back and forth. These women were calculating the shock waves of explosions, the trajectories of neutrons, the complex hydrodynamics of a collapsing star, all by hand. They worked in shifts, their fingers moving with practiced hypnotic speed. The sheets of paper next to them were covered in columns of numbers, a sea of digits that stretched on for miles. The sheer monotony of the sound was a trance in itself, a repetitive industrial lullaby that underpinned the high-level physics being debated in the offices next door. Down the hall, behind closed doors, the senior physicists stared at blackboards that had become landscapes of white dust. The chalk was their primary tool. They went through boxes of it. The sound of a piece of chalk snapping under the pressure of an intense thought was a common punctuation mark in the silence. They paced the wooden floors, the creaking of the boards marking their steps. 3 paces to the window, look out at the pine trees. 3 paces back to the board. It was a cage of intellect. The problems they were trying to solve were invisible, existing only in the abstract realm of mathematics, yet the tension they created was heavy enough to weigh down the air in the room. Further away from the quiet intensity of the T division lay the experimental sites, scattered deeper into the woods to avoid accidents. Here, the sounds were different. In the canyons below the mesa, the explosive experts worked. The shots, as they were called, were small test explosions. But from the main town they were felt more than heard, a dull thump that vibrated through the soles of your shoes, a sudden displacement of air that rattled the window panes in their frames. It happened so regularly that the residents eventually stopped looking up. It became just another pulse of the mountain, like a heartbeat. Deep within the guarded sectors, there were buildings with walls of concrete several feet thick. These housed the cyclotrons and the Van de Graaff accelerators, massive, towering machines designed to smash atoms. Entering these buildings felt like entering a cathedral of the future. The air was cool and smelled faintly of ozone, that crisp electric scent that comes after a lightning storm.
The machines hummed with a deep bass resonance, a vibration that you could feel in your chest. It was a power that felt restrained, a sleeping giant kept in a cage of copper and steel. The scientists who tended these machines worked in the glow of dials and oscilloscopes. Green lines waved across small round screens, tracing the ghosts of particles that no eye could see. The work here was slow and watchful. A technician might sit for hours on a stool, just watching a needle on a gauge, making a tiny adjustment to a knob, and then waiting again. The patience required was immense. It was a vigil. They were fishermen waiting by a dark, silent pond, waiting for a ripple that would tell them what was swimming beneath the surface. Outside the laboratories, the security apparatus continued its endless circling watch. The barbed wire fences were not just physical barriers, they were psychological ones. Inside the fence, the badge culture reigned supreme. Everyone wore a badge on their lapel, white for the elite scientists who knew everything, blue for the support staff who knew only what they needed to do their jobs. It created a strange social silence. A husband might have a white badge and his wife, working in the library, a blue one. They would eat dinner together in their small apartment, talk about the wind, the mud, the rationing of sugar, the leak in the roof, but they could not talk about their day. A vast, silent chasm lay between them, filled with secrets. This silence became a habit, a second skin that everyone wore. Lunchtime at the remote sites was a quiet affair. Men and women would sit on the flat rocks overlooking the canyons, opening metal lunch pails. They ate sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, looking out at the vastness of the Jemez Mountains. The landscape was ancient. Volcanic tuff formed millions of years ago, layered in bands of pink and orange. It was a stark contrast to the cutting-edge modernity of their work. Here they were, unlocking the secrets of the sun, while sitting on rocks that had been baked by the sun before humans walked the earth. The wind would rustle the dry scrub oak, and a hawk might screech high above, circling in the updrafts. In these moments, the project felt small, almost insignificant against the scale of geological time. As the afternoon wore on, the famous New Mexico fatigue would set in. The altitude took its toll. Breath was shorter here. Hearts beat a little faster to catch the thin oxygen. By 3 p.m., the mental fog would drift through the laboratories. The clacking of the calculators might slow just a fraction. This was the time for coffee. Gallons of black coffee were consumed in the secret city. The smell of brewing coffee was the second most common scent after the pine trees. It was the fuel that kept the eyes open, the gears turning. In the library, the silence was absolute. This was the repository of all known nuclear knowledge. Reports stamped secret and top secret in bold red ink were handled like holy texts. A librarian would slide a document across the desk with a whisper of paper on wood. The reader would take it to a quiet corner, the rustle of turning pages sounding loud in the stillness. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light falling from the high windows. Here, information was physical weight. You had to sign for it, carry it, guard it. The burden of knowledge was heavy, and the library was the vault where that weight was stored. Sometimes a storm would roll in during the late afternoon. The sky over the mountains would turn a bruised purple, heavy with rain. Thunder would echo through the canyons, sounding remarkably like the test explosions, blurring the line between nature and the man-made. The rain would come in a torrent, turning the dirt roads instantly into glue. The sound of the rain drumming on the tin roofs of the barracks was deafening and comforting at the same time. It washed the world clean. It drowned out the hum of the generators and the clacking of the machines. For a brief hour, the secret city would huddle under the deluge, the work pausing as everyone looked out the windows at the sheets of water graying out the world. Then, as quickly as it started, the rain would stop. The sun would break through, setting the wet sagebrush alight with a silver glow. The smell of wet earth, petrichor, would rise up, overwhelming and sweet, and the ants would return to their hill. The jeeps would churn through the mud, the scientists would return to their blackboards, and the great, slow machine of the Manhattan Project would resume its grinding rotation. The isolation was not just physical, it was temporal. They felt cut off from the timeline of the rest of the world. In Europe and the Pacific, history was moving at a breakneck speed, invasions, bombings, treaties. But on the Hill, time was measured in half-lives and microseconds. They were building a device to stop time, or perhaps to start a new kind of time. This suspension of reality made the days bleed into one another. Was it Tuesday or Friday? It didn't matter. There was only the problem and the steps needed to solve it. As the evening approached, the shift change signaled a subtle alteration in the city's breathing. The day workers walked back towards the housing areas, their shadows stretching long across the ground. But the lights in the tech area did not go out. The project was a creature that never slept. The night shift arrived, moving quietly through the gates. These were the caretakers of the long experiments, the watchers of the ovens and the centrifuges. Under the cover of darkness, the secret city looked like a scattering of fallen stars on the mesa top. The silence of the night was different, deeper, colder, and filled with the vast indifference of the desert universe.
Night in the high desert is a different country. When the sun dips below the Jemez Mountains, the temperature plummets, shedding 20 or 30 degrees in the span of an hour. The air becomes brittle and sharp, thinning out until every breath feels like inhaling cracked ice. Under this vast, freezing canopy, the secret city of Los Alamos glowed like an ember in the dark, a small, stubborn circle of light surrounded by miles of obsidian wilderness. For the military police on the night watch, the world was reduced to the sweeping beam of a flashlight and the crunch of boots on frozen gravel. The perimeter fence, miles long and menacing, hummed in the wind. The guards walked in pairs, their breath pluming in white clouds before them. They were young men, mostly, pulled from farms in the Midwest or cities in the East, standing guard over a mystery they were forbidden to understand. They watched the shadows of the pinning trees stretch and retract, playing tricks on the eyes. A coyote might dart across the road, eyes reflecting green in the torchlight, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. The silence out here on the perimeter was absolute, a heavy velvet quiet that pressed against the eardrums. Inside the technical area, the night shift had settled into a rhythm of low-intensity vigilance. The Chemistry and Metallurgy building, known as the CM building, was a fortress of ventilation. The air handling systems roared constantly, a white noise that drowned out footsteps and conversations. This was necessary. The substances being handled here, strange, heavy metals that felt warm to the touch, were dangerous in invisible ways. The scientists worked in glove boxes, their hands encased in thick rubber, manipulating beakers and crucibles behind glass. The movements were slow, underwater-like. There was no rushing with plutonium. In the dim light of the labs, the colors were muted. The liquids in the beakers glowed with eerie spectral hues,
pale greens, yellows, and the occasional flash of blue Cherenkov radiation, a ghost light that signaled high energy. The smell here was distinct, a mix of chemical solvents, floor wax, and the metallic tang of machined uranium. It was a sterile, industrial scent that clung to clothes and hair. A scientist might pause, rubbing eyes red from strain, and look out the window at the black square of the night. For a moment, the reflection in the glass would stare back, a face gaunt with fatigue, guarding the most dangerous secrets in human history. Meanwhile, in the residential quarters, a different kind of life unfolded behind the thin walls of the Sunt apartments and the bathtubs in the kitchen trailers. The housing was hastily built, the wood green and unseasoned. As the night grew colder, the buildings would groan and settle. The heating came from coal-fired stoves and furnaces, and a distinct sulfurous smell of coal smoke hung over the town, mixing with the crisp scent of the pines. It was the smell of winter in the 1940s, a cozy, choking blanket. The walls between the apartments were notoriously thin. In the quiet of the night, privacy was an illusion. Lying in bed, one could hear the murmur of the neighbor's radio, perhaps the crackling voice of a newscaster detailing the war in Europe, or the soaring strings of a symphony broadcast from Denver. You could hear the strike of a match, the crying of a baby, the creak of bed springs. This sonic intimacy created a strange bond. Everyone knew everyone's rhythms. If a scientist who usually paced the floor until 2 a.m. suddenly went to bed at 10 p.m., the neighbors would notice the silence. It was a community breathing in unison, a hive where every cell was connected by sound. In the center of the town lay the social hub, the tech area of human interaction. The theater was a sanctuary. Here, the flickering light of a projector offered the only true escape. For 2 hours, the residents could forget the equations and the wire fences. They watched Hollywood musicals and noir thrillers, their faces illuminated by the silver screen. But even here, reality intruded. Before the feature, newsreels would play. Images of tanks rolling across France, of ships burning in the Pacific. The audience would watch in silence. They knew that what they were doing in the labs down the street was directly connected to those images, a silent thread linking the dark theater in New Mexico to the battlefields of the world. Then there was the post office, the nerve center of the censorship operation. Even at night, the work of the censors continued. In a back room, men and women sat at long tables with stacks of letters, outgoing mail from the scientists to their families. They read every word. They held the lives of thousands in their hands. A razor blade would slice through the paper, excising a sentence about the weather, which could indicate location, or a mention of a colleague's name. Sometimes entire paragraphs were blacked out with heavy ink. The sound in this room was the soft shh, shh, shh of paper sliding and the scratch of the censor's pen. It was a quiet violence, a pruning of human connection to fit the shape of security. As the night deepened towards 3 a.m., the witching hour of the project arrived. This was when the most eccentric behaviors emerged. Up in the boys' school lodge, a rhythmic drumming might begin. It was Richard Feynman, the young genius, playing his bongos. He would sit alone or with a few friends, tapping out complex, syncopated rhythms that echoed off the canyon walls. Tap, to tap, tap, boom. It was a primal, human sound in the midst of high technology. It was the sound of a mind needing to break free from the rigid structures of mathematics, finding release in the chaos of a beat. To a guard walking the perimeter, the distant drumming must have sounded like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. In the quietest corners of the library, the security patrols would sometimes find a scientist asleep at a desk, head resting on a stack of classified reports. The exhaustion was physical and mental. The sheer volume of knowledge being generated was overwhelming. They were writing the book of nuclear physics as they went along, page by arduous page. The guard would gently wake the sleeper, check their badge, and remind them of the security protocols. Even in sleep, the rules applied. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their slow, majestic arcs. The Milky Way was a dense river of diamond dust, clearer here than almost anywhere else in America. The astronomers and physicists, men who spent their days calculating the life and death of atoms, would often step outside just to look up. They understood the fusion burning in those distant suns. They knew that they were trying to replicate that same celestial fire here on Earth in a metal sphere the size of a grapefruit. The thought was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Standing in the freezing dark, wrapped in heavy wool coats, they felt the weight of the cosmos pressing down on them. The silence of the pre-dawn hours was the deepest of all. The coal fires would burn down to embers. The wind would die away, leaving the pine trees motionless. The only sound might be the distant rumble of a truck convoy making the long climb up the switchbacks from Santa Fe, bringing water, food, or perhaps a crate marked "Handle with extreme care." The convoy's headlights would sweep across the cliffs, searching for the road, cutting through the black void. Inside the houses, the residents slept under heavy Army-issue blankets. They dreamed of their old lives, of grassy lawns in New Jersey, of tea shops in London, of university lecture halls in Berkeley. They dreamed of a world without fences, but when they woke, the first thing they would see was the dust on the windowsill, the badge on the nightstand, and the high wire fence cutting across the sunrise. The transition from night to day was a gradual bluing of the sky. The sharp edges of the mountains would reappear, first as silhouettes, then as three-dimensional forms of rock and scrub. The birds, jays and ravens, would begin to call, their harsh cries piercing the morning air. The smell of coffee would rise again, a phantom aroma drifting from hundreds of kitchens simultaneously. The machine was waking up. The night shift would file out, eyes bleary, passing the day shift coming in. A nod, a murmur, a flashing of badges. The baton was passed. The work of the secret city continued, an endless loop of calculation and construction, spinning silently in the center of the American desert. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the morning frost, the secret city revealed its most paradoxically normal feature: children. In a place built for the construction of a weapon of mass destruction, the sounds of hopscotch and jump rope echoed against the wooden barracks. The isolation of the mesa created a unique enclosed childhood. The children of the Nobel laureates and the maintenance workers attended the same makeshift school, their playground a patch of dirt surrounded by the ever-present barbed wire. They were the only residents who did not look at the fences with suspicion. To them, the perimeter was simply the edge of the world, as natural as a cliff or a shoreline. Domestic life on the hill was a constant battle against the elements and the rules. For the wives of the scientists, many of whom had no idea what their husbands were actually building, the days were filled with a specific high-altitude drudgery. Cooking at 7,000 feet was a science in itself. Water boiled at a lower temperature, meaning beans took hours to soften, and cakes often fell flat, turning into dense, doughy pucks. The kitchen became a laboratory of trial and error, mirroring the physics experiments happening down the road. Pressure cookers hissed in almost every kitchen, their rhythmic chug-chug-chug providing a percussive soundtrack to the afternoons. Shopping was an exercise in organized chaos. The commissary, a long warehouse-like building, smelled of cardboard, produce, and floor wax. It was the only place to buy food. There was no competition, no choice of brands. You took what the army provided. Cans of Spam, powdered milk, and dehydrated eggs were staples. Fresh vegetables were a luxury that arrived by truck, often wilted from the long, hot journey up the canyon. The women moved through the aisles with ration books in hand, their conversations a careful dance of omission. They talked about the wind, the mud, and the scarcity of nylon stockings, but never about the gadget, the word whispered by their husbands in their sleep. And then there were the babies. The population of Los Alamos was overwhelmingly young. The average age was mid-20s, and nature took its course. The hospital on the hill was a busy, bright place, smelling of antiseptic and fresh linen. But even birth was a state secret here. Every baby born in the secret city had the same peculiar detail on their birth certificate. Place of birth, P.O. Box 1663. Technically, they were born in a post office box. It was a bureaucratic fiction that erased their true origin, rendering them children of a ghost town. The nursery was filled with the soft cries of infants who officially did not exist in a place that wasn't on any map. In this sealed environment, social lines blurred in strange ways. The military personnel and the civilian scientists were two different tribes forced to share a campfire. The army ran the town with rigid discipline, lights out, badge checks, strict categorization. The scientists, free thinkers by nature, chafed against the rules. They didn't like to make their beds. They didn't like to salute. The tension between the olive-drab uniforms and the tweed jackets was a low-level hum, like a fluorescent light about to flicker out. General Leslie Groves, the military head, was a man of corpulent efficiency, stomping through the mud, demanding schedules. Oppenheimer, the scientific head, was a whisper of smoke and poetry, drifting through the labs, asking for breakthroughs. The friction between these two forces generated the heat that drove the project forward. But amidst the tension, there were spies. Not the cinematic kind with silencers and tuxedos, but the quiet, helpful kind. Klaus Fuchs was one of them. A brilliant German physicist, a refugee, he was a man who blended into the background like beige wallpaper. He was polite, unassuming, and incredibly competent. He worked deep in the heart of the theoretical division, calculating the efficiency of the implosion lens. He drove a battered old car and was known to be a kind babysitter for his colleagues' children. Imagine him sitting in a living room on a Tuesday evening, the parents out at a meeting. He reads a story to a child, his voice soft and accented. The fire crackles in the stove. The wind howls outside. He is the picture of a gentle uncle. Yet in his mind, he carries the blueprints of the apocalypse. He memorizes the dimensions of the uranium core, the firing rates of the detonators. Later, he will drive down the winding road to Santa Fe, ostensibly to buy supplies, but really to pass a package to a contact by a bridge or in a quiet park. The betrayal was silent and invisible, woven into the very fabric of the community's trust. The secret in the secret city was not just about the bomb, it was about the person sitting next to you at lunch. As 1944 bled into 1945, the pressure began to physically manifest in the town. The tech area expanded, eating up more of the mesa. New buildings appeared overnight, springing up like mushrooms after rain. These were the sites for the high explosives. The implosion design, the concept of squeezing a plutonium core until it went critical, required explosives of unprecedented precision. The scientists were no longer just writing equations, they were casting lenses of explosive material, shapes that looked like rounded honeycombs. The work with explosives brought a new sound to the mesa, the crump of testing. Down in the canyons at sites with names like S-Site and Anchor Ranch, men were blowing things up. They worked with molds and molten explosives that looked like hot fudge but could level a city block. The smell in these canyons was acrid, cordite and burnt chemicals. The trees nearby were often stripped of their leaves by the shock waves. It was a landscape of violent alteration. The men who worked there had a distinct look, soot-stained faces and eyes that were constantly scanning for the smallest irregularity. A bubble in the explosive cast, a crack in the lens, these were fatal errors. To cope with the mounting stress, the parties became legendary. In the dormitories and the lodges, the Saturday night gatherings grew more intense. The alcohol was often a punch made from pure laboratory ethanol, 190 proof, mixed with whatever juice or soda was available. It was rocket fuel, known as tech area punch. The taste was medicinal and sharp, cutting through the dusty throats of the drinkers. They drank to forget the physics, to forget the war, to forget the terrible thing they were building. The phonograph would play Glenn Miller or Benny Goodman, the brassy swing music filling the room. Couples danced with a frantic energy, spinning and dipping as if trying to outrun the future. The air would get hot and smoky, filled with the haze of hundreds of cigarettes. Through the haze, you might see a Nobel laureate laughing too loudly, or a young mathematician weeping quietly in the corner. It was a manic release. They were living on the edge of a cliff, both geographically and historically, and the vertigo was setting in. And always, watching it all, was the desert. The landscape of New Mexico was the silent witness. The Rio Grande flowed far below in the valley, a ribbon of brown water that had seen centuries of conquerors come and go, the Spanish, the Americans, and now the physicists. The mesas were dotted with the ruins of the ancestral Puebloans, ancient cliff dwellings carved into the soft volcanic rock. The scientists would sometimes hike there on Sundays, climbing wooden ladders into the cool, dark caves where people had lived 1,000 years ago. Sitting in those ancient rooms, looking out at the same unchanging mountains, they felt a strange kinship with the vanished tribes. They too were a temporary civilization clinging to the rock. They too were leaving marks on the earth that would last forever. The seasons turned again. Spring brought the violent winds, the dust devils that spun across the dry ground like miniature tornadoes. The dust was so fine it penetrated the double-paned windows of the laboratories. It settled on the graphite blocks of the reactors and the polished steel of the bomb casings. It was a reminder that nature was trying to reclaim the site. The struggle against the dust was a daily ritual, wiping down surfaces, covering sensitive equipment with tarps, blowing out the filters. The sound of air compressors hissing to clean the instruments became part of the daily symphony. By the summer of 1945, the atmosphere on the hill had tightened into a knot. The gadget was nearing completion. The theoretical became physical. Trucks arrived carrying heavy crates lined with lead. The security at the gates doubled. The casual nods were replaced by rigid inspections. The silence in the dining halls grew heavier. Everyone knew, without being told, that the end was coming. The climax of the story was no longer on a blackboard. It was being assembled in a clean room, piece by heavy piece.
July of 1945 brought a heat that felt personal. The sun beat down on the mesa with a relentless, hammering intensity, baking the mud into hard, cracked puzzles of clay. The pine trees, usually the source of a cool, resinous scent, now stood motionless, their needles brown and brittle, waiting for rain that refused to come. On the hill, the air was thick with the static of imminent change. The theoretical work was done. The blackboards were erased. Now the focus shifted from the mind to the hand, from the abstract to the concrete. It was time to leave the sanctuary of the mountains and descend into the desert basin. The destination was a stretch of barren land 200 miles south, a place with a name that sounded like a warning from history: Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man. It was a flat, desolate expanse of sand and scrub brush, rimmed by distant, jagged mountains that looked like saw blades against the white-hot sky. This was where the gadget would meet its destiny. The migration began in secret convoys. Unmarked army trucks and dusty sedans slipped out of the Los Alamos gates before dawn, winding down the treacherous switchbacks, leaving the cool air of the high elevation behind for the furnace of the valley. Inside the cars, the scientists sat in silence, watching the landscape change. The green of the ponderosa pines gave way to the gnarled shapes of cholla cactus and mesquite. The heat grew heavier with every mile, a physical weight pressing against the windows. They were carrying the components of the bomb in suitcases and crates, treating them with the tenderness of religious relics. One car carried the plutonium core, a small sphere of warm metal nestled in a shock-proof container. Another carried the gold-plated initiator. They drove through sleepy New Mexico towns, past gas stations and diners, the locals completely unaware that the end of the war, and perhaps the end of an era, was passing them by in a dusty Plymouth sedan. Arriving at the Trinity site was like landing on the surface of Mars. The isolation was absolute. There was nothing here but wind, sand, and the blinding sun. The base camp was a hastily erected collection of wooden shacks and canvas tents, flapping listlessly in the hot breeze. The dust was different here, alkaline and white, coating everything in a fine, ghostly powder. It got into the water, the food, the bedding. The men walked with heads down, squinting against the glare. The sound of the wind was constant, a dry, hissing whisper as it moved through the sagebrush. At the center of this emptiness stood the McDonald Ranch house. It was an abandoned adobe structure, its walls weathered by decades of sandstorms. This humble house, with its creaking wooden floors and simple stone fireplace, was about to become the most technologically advanced clean room on the planet. The scientists took over the master bedroom. They sealed the windows with heavy black tape and plastic sheeting to keep out the relentless dust. They scrubbed the floors until the wood grain shone. Inside this sealed room, the atmosphere was surgical. The assembly of the core was a slow, terrifyingly precise ritual. Men in white coats and cotton gloves moved with the deliberate slowness of underwater divers.
The only sounds were the breathing of the men and the soft click of metal meeting metal. Outside, the desert wind battered the adobe walls, but inside, the air was still and hot. They were assembling a puzzle where the pieces were made of uranium and plutonium, and the penalty for a mistake was immediate and catastrophic. There was a moment of pure, suspended tension when the two hemispheres of the core were brought together. The pieces were warm. Plutonium generates its own heat from radioactive decay. As they were lowered into place, the Geiger counters in the room began to click, a frantic, rising chatter like a disturbed nest of insects. Tick, 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 bzzz. The scientists froze. A hand steadied. The clicking slowed. They exhaled. The heart of the device was beating. It was a moment of intimacy with the fundamental forces of the universe, happening in a dusty ranch house in the middle of nowhere. Once assembled, the core was driven to the test tower, a 100-foot steel skeleton rising from the desert floor. The gadget itself was a monstrous sphere of metal and wires, looking less like a weapon and more like a diving bell from a Jules Verne novel. It was hoisted up the tower on a winch, swaying gently in the breeze. The sound of the winch motor, whir, clank, whir, echoed across the flat basin. Slowly, inch by inch, the device rose toward the sky, until it sat in a small metal shed at the top, overlooking the vast, empty world it was designed to destroy. As the date of the test approached, July 16th, the weather, the one variable the scientists couldn't control, began to turn. The summer heat had built up massive thunderheads over the mountains. In the afternoons, the sky would turn a bruised, angry purple. Lightning would arc across the horizon, silent at first, then followed seconds later by the low, rolling boom of thunder. For a project dependent on delicate electrical detonators, a lightning storm was a nightmare. The night before the test, the storm broke directly over ground zero. It was a tempest of biblical proportions. Rain lashed the desert floor, turning the dust into a slick, sticky clay. The wind howled through the steel lattice of the tower, making it groan and shudder. In the bunkers 10,000 yards away, the scientists huddled, listening to the rain drumming on the concrete roofs. The tension was suffocating. Robert Oppenheimer, thin to the point of emaciation, paced the floor of the control bunker, chain-smoking, his silhouette casting long, nervous shadows against the wall. The sound of the rain was hypnotic and maddening. Pat, 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 pat. It was nature's last attempt to wash away the intruder. The test was delayed. 2 a.m., 3 a.m. The scientists tried to sleep on cots, but the air was too heavy, charged with ozone and anxiety. They lay in the dark, listening to the thunder, wondering if a stray bolt of lightning would strike the tower and trigger the end before it even began. In the control bunker, the mood was somber. General Groves and Oppenheimer debated the weather in hushed tones. The meteorologist, a man carrying the weight of the world on his forecast, studied his charts under a flickering bulb. He predicted a break in the storm just before dawn, a small window of stillness. Waiting. The act of waiting in the desert is a unique form of meditation. Time seems to stretch and distort. The seconds tick by with agonizing slowness. In the observation shelters, men played cards without really looking at their hands. They drank coffee that had gone cold hours ago. They applied sunscreen in the middle of the night, a surreal preparation for a man-made sun. They put on dark welding goggles, turning the world into a murky green abyss. Outside, the rain finally began to taper off. The wind dropped. The puddles on the ground reflected the jagged, retreating lightning. The air was suddenly cool, washed clean by the storm, smelling of wet sage and ozone. The silence returned to the Jornada del Muerto, but it was a different silence now. It was a held breath. The tower stood black against the clearing sky, a lonely sentinel in the dark. At 5:10 a.m., the countdown began. It wasn't a digital voice, but a man with a microphone, reading the time remaining off a stopwatch. Minus 20 minutes. The voice crackled over the loudspeakers at the base camp, drifting out over the wet sand. The scientists moved to their designated spots. Some lay flat on the ground, feet facing the tower, burying their faces in the dirt. Others stood behind thick glass, adjusting their dark glasses. Minus 10 minutes. The world was perfectly still. Even the crickets seemed to have stopped their chirping. The only sound was the rhythmic breathing of men trying to calm their racing hearts. Minus 2 minutes. A green flare shot up from the control bunker, a silent spark arcing into the pre-dawn darkness. It was a beautiful, harmless spark, a final moment of conventional fire before the unleashing of the unconventional. Minus 45 seconds. The automatic timer took over. A mechanical drum began to rotate, closing circuits with precise metallic clicks. Click, click, click. The machine was now in control. The humans were just spectators. 10, 9, 8. The numbers hung in the cool morning air. In those final seconds, time didn't just slow down, it seemed to stop completely. Every sensory detail was etched into the minds of the watchers. The grain of the sand near their eyes, the smell of the damp earth, the fading darkness of the sky.
At the moment of zero, the desert did not explode with noise. It exploded with silence. The first sensation was not sound, but light. A light so intense, so absolute, that it defied the human capacity to process it. It was a white that was whiter than white, a searing brilliance that turned the pre-dawn darkness into a noon brighter than any sun the earth had ever known. Even through the thick, dark welding glass, the flash was blinding. For those facing away, the light reflected off the surrounding mountains, illuminating every crevice, every scrub bush, every grain of sand with a clarity that was almost hallucinationous. The shadows of the cacti were cast instantly and sharply against the ground, frozen for a split second in the harsh monochromatic glare. It was a silent, expanding sun. In that first microsecond, the steel tower, the one that had stood so tall and solid against the storm, simply ceased to exist. It was vaporized, turned into gas before it could even melt. The fireball began to rise. It was not just fire, it was a living, breathing sphere of plasma, churning and boiling with colors that had no name: purple, violet, sickly green, and a terrifying, beautiful orange. It expanded outward and upward with a majestic, terrifying slowness, like a great balloon being inflated by the breath of a god. The silence held. Light travels faster than sound, and for the observers 10 miles away, the event was a silent movie of the apocalypse. They watched the fireball climb, roiling and twisting, pulling the desert floor up with it. The dirt, the sand, the fused glass of the crater, all of it was sucked into the stem of the growing mushroom cloud. It was hypnotic. It was the most beautiful and the most terrible thing any of them had ever seen. Then the heat arrived. It came as a wave, a sudden opening of a furnace door across miles of empty space.
It felt like a physical touch on the skin, a warm, dry caress that ignored the cold morning air. It was the heat of a star transported to the surface of the planet. And finally, the sound. It took 40 seconds for the shock wave to cross the basin. It arrived not as a sharp crack, but as a wall of pressure. Boom! A deep, resonant thud that hit the chest like a heavy hand. The earth shook beneath their feet, a rolling tremor that felt like the desert itself was shuddering. The sound echoed off the mountains, rolling back and forth, a long, sustained thunder that seemed to go on forever. It was the voice of the atom finally speaking after billions of years of silence. In the bunkers, the reaction was a mixture of primal relief and intellectual awe. Men shook hands, but their grips were weak. Some laughed, a jagged, hysterical sound. Others just stood and stared. Kenneth Bainbridge, the test director, turned to Oppenheimer and said, with a grim sort of finality, "Now we are all sons of bitches." Oppenheimer himself stood in the doorway of the control bunker, his silhouette framed by the fading glow of the cloud. He did not cheer. He watched the cloud flatten out at the top of the atmosphere, forming the iconic mushroom shape that would haunt the nightmares of the coming century. In his mind, the verses of the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, echoed quietly. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The words weren't spoken, but they hung in the air around him, heavy and irrevocable. The cloud drifted slowly to the northeast, a radioactive ghost carried by the high-altitude winds. The sun began to rise properly now, a pale, ordinary yellow orb climbing over the mountains, seemingly dim and powerless compared to the man-made star that had just faded. The desert returned to its usual stillness, but it was a changed place. The sand at ground zero had been fused into a strange green glass, trinitite. It crunched underfoot, a new mineral born from the heat of a second sun. The journey back to Los Alamos was a somber one. The buses and cars wound their way back up the long, dusty road to the mesa. The euphoria of the technical success, the "it worked," began to fade, replaced by the heavy realization of what it actually meant. They had handed humanity the means of its own extinction. The conversation in the cars was sparse. Men looked out at the passing landscape, the adobe villages, the grazing sheep, the timeless mountains, and saw them differently now. Everything looked fragile. Back on the hill, the news spread not by announcement, but by atmosphere. The scientists who returned walked differently. They carried a secret that was too big to keep, yet too terrible to tell. The wives looked at their husbands' faces and saw the shadow of the cloud reflected in their eyes. They didn't ask what happened. They asked, "Is it over?" And the answer was a nod. The gadget was no longer a theory, it was a reality. And now the second one, Little Boy, was already on its way across the Pacific Ocean. The timeline was moving faster now, accelerating toward a violent conclusion. Life in the secret city entered a strange, suspended state. The frantic pace of the last 2 years evaporated. The labs were quieter. The urgency was gone, replaced by a waiting game. The scientists went through the motions, writing reports, cataloging data, but their minds were thousands of miles away, over a city in Japan. They listened to the radio with an intensity that bordered on obsession. On August 6th, the voice of the president came over the airwaves. 16 hours ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima. The announcement echoed through the wooden halls of the laboratories and the living rooms of the Sunt apartments. People stopped in the streets. The silence that followed was different from the silence of the desert. It was the silence of a held breath finally being released, but released into a room that had suddenly lost all its air. The celebration that followed was complex. There were parties, yes. There was relief that the war, the bloody, grinding war that had taken so many lives, would likely end soon. But beneath the clinking glasses and the music, there was a profound unease. The scientists knew better than anyone what had happened to the people on the ground. They knew about the heat, the pressure, the radiation. They weren't just celebrating a victory. They were mourning the loss of a simpler world. In the days that followed, the fences of Los Alamos seemed to grow taller. The world now knew their secret. The hill was no longer a rumor. It was the most famous place on Earth. Reporters began to circle. The phone lines were jammed. The isolation that had protected them, that had created the dreamlike, hypnotic state of their work, was shattered. But the routine of the mesa, stubborn and ingrained, continued for a little while longer. The wind still blew through the canyons. The dust still settled on the furniture. The guards still checked the badges. The sun still set over the Jemez Mountains in a blaze of purple and gold. One evening, shortly after the end of the war, a group of physicists gathered on the porch of the lodge. They watched the twilight deepen. The air was cool and smelled of rain. They talked quietly, not about physics, but about the future. They spoke of international control, of peaceful power, of a world where their invention would never be used again. They were trying to put the genie back in the bottle, using words to bind a force that was beyond language. As the stars came out, shining with that piercing high-altitude clarity, one of them pointed up. "It's peaceful," he said, and it was. The universe was vast and indifferent to the struggles of the small creatures on this one rocky planet. The Milky Way arced overhead, a bridge of light spanning the darkness. For a moment, the weight of their creation lifted. They were just men again, standing on a mountain, looking at the stars. The wind picked up, rustling the pine needles. It was the same wind that had blown here before the scientists came, and it would be the same wind that blew long after they were gone. It carried the scent of the deep desert, of ancient rocks and dry earth. It whispered through the screens of the porch, a soft, rhythmic, hushing sound. Hush, hush. The secret city was beginning to dissolve. The temporary wooden buildings would eventually be torn down or fall apart. The mud would dry and turn to dust. The names on the badges would fade, but the silence of the mesa would remain, a heavy, watchful silence that held the memory of the fire. And so the story of the Manhattan Project began to drift into history. It became a legend, a myth of men who stole fire from the gods and then had to live with the burns. But on those quiet nights in late 1945, before the world moved on, there was a stillness that felt eternal, a stillness where the only movement was the slow rotation of the earth and the steady beating of the human heart.
The war ended not with a bang, but with a signature on a deck in Tokyo Bay. But on the hill, the true ending was a slow, quiet unraveling of the tight-knit community that had formed in the vacuum of secrecy.
September 1945 brought the first touch of autumn to the Pajarito Plateau. The aspens in the high country began to turn a brilliant, trembling gold, standing out against the dark green of the pines like flames. The air grew crisp again, signaling the return of the long, cold winter. But this time, the winter would be different. The urgency was gone. The race was over. For the scientists, the weeks following the bombings were a blur of confusion and moral reckoning. The jubilation of VJ Day had faded into a somber, reflective mood. They had succeeded beyond their wildest calculations, but the cost was now visible in the grainy black-and-white photographs coming out of Japan. Shadows burned into concrete, cities flattened into gray wastelands. The gadget was no longer a physics problem. It was a reality that had incinerated over 100,000 souls. The guilt was a quiet, heavy presence in the laboratories, sitting in the corners of the rooms like the dust that could never be swept away. Robert Oppenheimer, the man who had held the fragile web of the project together with his sheer charisma, looked like a ghost. He was exhausted, his frame skeletal, his eyes haunted. On October 16, 1945, his final day as director, a ceremony was held at the outdoor theater. It was a clear, brisk day. The sun was bright, but it offered little warmth. Oppenheimer accepted a certificate of appreciation from the Army, but his words were a warning, not a celebration. He spoke of the deep trouble that science had brought to mankind. He spoke of the need for a new way of thinking. As he stepped down from the podium, the wind snatched his words and carried them off into the canyon, a whisper of caution to a world that was already rushing to build more, bigger, deadlier weapons. The exodus began. The longhairs, as the military called the academics, began to pack their trunks. The reverse migration was just as surreal as the arrival. The station at Lamy, once the gateway to the unknown, was now the exit door. Trains chugged away, carrying the Fermis, the Bathies, the Tellers back to the universities of Chicago, Cornell, and Berkeley. They left behind the mud, the fences, and the security badges. They returned to a world that now hailed them as heroes, the men who won the war, but they carried a silence within them that no applause could fill. The town they left behind did not disappear, but it changed. The temporary wooden barracks, meant to last only for the duration of the war, began to sag. The green paint peeled in the harsh UV light. The secret city became just a government town, a place of bureaucracy and continued research, but the magic, the manic energy of the early days was evaporated. The spirit of the place, that strange, intense camaraderie of geniuses living in a mud puddle, was gone.
Yet the landscape remained. The mesa, ancient and indifferent, reclaimed its dominance. The wind continued its work, eroding the cliffs, shifting the sand, smoothing over the footprints of the physicists. If you were to walk through the abandoned technical areas in the late 1940s, it would have felt like walking through the ruins of a lost civilization. The concrete bowls where they had tested explosives were filled with rainwater and tumbleweeds. The guard towers stood empty, staring out at nothing. The silence of the desert, which had been pushed back by the roar of machinery and the chatter of typewriters, flowed back in like a rising tide. It is this silence that endures. Imagine standing on the edge of the mesa tonight. The secret city is now a modern laboratory, but the ghosts of 1943 are still there, in the quiet spaces between the buildings. The sun has set,
leaving a bruised purple streak across the western horizon. The air is rapidly cooling, the heat of the day radiating back out into space. The scent of the high desert rises up, a mix of sagebrush, dry earth, and the resinous, vanilla-like smell of the ponderosa pines. It is a smell that has not changed in 10,000 years. Listen. The wind moves through the needles of the pines with a sound like the ocean, a soft shh that rises and falls. It is a hypnotic, rhythmic sound, the breathing of the mountain. It flows over the roofs of the old houses on Bathtub Row, where the Nobel Prize winners once lived. It rattles the loose panes of glass in the few remaining wartime structures. It whispers through the chain-link fences that still surround the sensitive areas, making the metal hum with a low, mournful note. Far below, in the canyons, the coyotes begin their evening song. It starts with a single, lonely yip, then is joined by another and another, until a chorus of yips and howls echoes off the canyon walls. It is a wild, prehistoric sound, a reminder that despite the cyclotrons and the supercomputers, this is still a wilderness. The coyotes are the true owners of the night. They trot silently along the old patrol roads, their paws making no sound on the packed dirt. They stop and listen, ears twitching, watching the lights of the town with golden, unblinking eyes. The sky above is a vast, crushing dome of stars. Without the light pollution of a major city, the Milky Way is a thick, bright band of diamond dust stretching from horizon to horizon. You can see the constellations wheeling slowly overhead: Orion, Cassiopeia, the Big Dipper, marking the passage of time in a language much older than atoms. The scientists looked up at these same stars. They derived their equations from the same physics that burns in those distant suns. There is a profound peace in this connection, a sense of returning to the source. As the night deepens, the stillness becomes heavy. The traffic dies down. Lights in the windows go out one by one. The mesa floats in a sea of darkness, a ship drifting through the night. The only movement is the slow drift of the clouds and the swaying of the trees. The history of the place, the spies, the secrets, the panic, the triumph, all of it settles into the sediment of the geology. It is just another layer in the rock, sandwiched between the volcanic ash of 1,000,000 years ago and the dust of tomorrow. The anxiety of the human endeavor fades away, leaving only the elemental reality of the high desert. Stone, sky, wind, silence. The gadget is gone. The war is over. The men and women who built the fire have passed into history, but the place remains. It is a sanctuary of quiet, a place where the earth sleeps a deep, dreamless sleep. Close your eyes and imagine the sound of that wind again. Whoosh, hush, whoosh, hush. It sweeps away the noise of the modern world. It sweeps away the worry. It sweeps away the questions. There is only the cool air, the smell of pine, and the vast, comforting dark. The secret city sleeps. The desert sleeps. And in this immense, ancient silence, everything is at rest.